A television comedy taping is the most controlled environment in which stand-up comedy is performed. The variables that make a live performance unpredictable, the size and mood of the crowd, the acoustic qualities of the room, the temperature of the audience's attention, the specific energy that accumulates in a room as a crowd arrives and settles, are, in a taping, managed with a precision that live clubs cannot achieve. A warm-up act prepares the audience in advance. A producer speaks to the crowd before the taping begins to calibrate their expectations and their energy. The lights come up to a predetermined level. The cameras are positioned. The audience, by the time the main performer walks out, has been given every available tool to make what follows successful. Which is why, when the first bit doesn't land in a television comedy taping, the silence is unlike the silence of any other comedy environment. The silence in a club when something doesn't land is, in some sense, ordinary. Clubs are unpredictable. Crowds are unpredictable. The variables are not managed. A bit that doesn't land in a club tells the performer something about the bit, or about this room, or about this crowd, or about this particular night. And the performer adjusts and continues. The feedback is direct, and the recovery is immediate, and the next attempt begins as soon as the silence resolves. The silence in a television taping, when the first bit doesn't land, is something else. The audience was prepared. The conditions were optimized. The cameras are rolling and will record whatever happens next, and the bit didn't land. The particular quiet that follows is not the neutral quiet of an audience withholding judgment. It is the specific, slightly uncomfortable quiet of a room that was expecting to laugh and didn't, that knows it was supposed to laugh and didn't, and that is now, collectively, uncertain about what comes next. What he did in those 30 seconds was not a bit. It was not material in the ordinary sense, not a constructed piece of comedy that had been written and rehearsed and brought to the taping as part of the show. It was something that lived in the space between prepared material and genuine presence, the specific kind of contact with an audience that is only available when the prepared material has temporarily stopped, and what remains is the performer's actual relationship to the room they are in. The floor director, who was positioned to observe both the performer and the audience throughout the taping, has described what she saw in those 30 seconds as the moment the taping became something different from what it had been in the opening minutes. Not better by the conventional measure of a taping, not more prepared, not more controlled, not more certain of its own success, but more real, more in contact with whatever the room actually was, rather than with what the warm-up act and the producer's introduction had tried to make the room be before the cameras started rolling. The audience, which had been a television studio audience, people who had come to be part of a taping, who were performing the role of audience for cameras, who were conscious of the environment in a way that a club crowd almost never is, became in those 30 seconds something closer to a real audience. The self-consciousness that studio audiences carry, the awareness of the cameras, the awareness of being recorded, the particular kind of performance that recording requires of the people being recorded, lifted. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough that what followed in the taping, once Katt Williams moved from those 30 seconds back into the prepared material, found a room that was different from the room that had received the first bit in silence. The taping continued. The material that followed the 30 seconds, the bits that the show was actually built around, the material that had been prepared for this specific format and this specific environment, landed in a room that had been changed by what had happened in the gap between the first bit's silence and the recovery. The laughs came differently. Not bigger, necessarily, or more frequent, but more fully inhabited. The particular laughter of an audience that has stopped performing its own enjoyment and has started actually experiencing something. The first bit in a television comedy taping has a specific function that goes beyond its function in a live show. In a live show, the first bit establishes the comedian's voice and sets the audience's expectations for the evening. If it doesn't fully land, the next bit can recover, and the bit after that, and the accumulated forward motion of a set that is working can carry the audience past the memory of a single moment that didn't quite connect. In a taping, the first bit has an additional function. It tells the audience how to be an audience for what follows. It calibrates the room's relationship to the performer. When it works, when the first bit produces the laugh that the warm-up and the producer's introduction have been preparing the room to give, the audience settles into the role of an audience that is participating in something that is working. When it doesn't work, the audience loses the particular ease that a successful opening produces, and something more effortful takes its place. A consciousness of watching rather than being inside, a slight anxiety about what comes next, a relationship to the performer that is no longer simply responsive, but has become, in some small but significant way, uncertain. The 30 seconds that followed the first bit's silence in the taping were the 30 seconds that, by all accounts from the people who were in the studio that night, changed the shape of everything that came after them. Katt Williams did not repeat the bit. He did not apologize for it. He did not acknowledge, in any of the ways that performers typically acknowledge a moment that hasn't worked, that a moment had not worked. What he did was something that the people who were in the studio, the camera operators, the floor director, the production team members whose jobs kept them in view of both the performer and the audience simultaneously, have described in different ways but with consistent substance. He used the silence. Not to fill it, not to replace it with the next bit as quickly as possible, which would have been the expected move, the rational move, the move that a comedian in a taping makes when the opening doesn't land and the cameras are rolling and the whole structure of the evening requires forward motion. He used it. He inhabited it. He turned toward the audience in the particular way that a performer turns toward a room when they are not performing at the room, but with it. And he did something with those 30 seconds that the audience, which had been uncertain and slightly uncomfortable, was not prepared for. What the taping produced, what the cameras captured across the full arc of that evening, from the silence after the first bit, through the 30 seconds that followed it, through the remainder of the show, was not the taping it had been designed to produce. The design had assumed a warm audience that would receive the prepared material in a predictable sequence and produce the responses that the format required. The silence after the first bit had interrupted that design. What the cameras captured instead was a taping that contained something the design had not planned for. Evidence of what happens when the controlled environment produces the condition it is designed to prevent, and the performer responds to that condition not by recovering toward the design, but by going somewhere the design had not anticipated. The people who were in the studio that night, the production team, the camera operators, the floor director, have described the overall arc of the evening as one they remember more clearly than most tapings they have worked. Not because of the technical execution, not because the material was unusually strong or the audience unusually enthusiastic, but because of that gap. Those 30 seconds after the silence, before the recovery. The moment when the format stopped being the format and the room became something else for long enough to change what the room was capable of afterward. In the final edit of the taping, if one was produced and aired, those 30 seconds may or may not have been included. Tapings get edited. The format's requirements determine what stays and what doesn't. A moment that lives outside the format may not survive the process that formats impose on their own content. But in the room, on the night, for the people who were there, the silence existed. The 30 seconds existed. And the taping that followed them was different from the taping that would have existed without them. The audience didn't laugh. And then something happened that no one had prepared for, and no one forgot.